For years, governments have been looking for ways to punish those who have committed the most heinous crimes. This video contains the craziest execution stories that will make your skin crawl. From ancient methods to modern-day executions that defy all logic, from Wallace Wilkerson, who had 5 riflemen shoot at him, but they all somehow missed vital organs and he had to bleed to death, to Clayton Lockett, who was administered a lethal injection that failed to kill him. These crazy execution stories will have you rethink the death penalty and make you feel bad even for the worst of criminals. So, without further ado, let's get started. William Kemmler. William Kemmler's execution has to be the craziest of all time. Imagine surviving an electric execution. William Kemmler, a German-American street peddler convicted of murdering his partner in a drunken rage, was chosen as the first person to be executed in an electric chair in the late 1880s. The event was preceded by intense legal battles and public debate over its ethics. Nevertheless, the execution proceeded as planned. The electric chair was a result of an invention from Thomas Edison's workshop in West Orange, New Jersey. Edison, though opposed to capital punishment, supported electrocution over hanging during his current war with alternating current advocate George Westinghouse, believing it to be quicker and less painful. On the day of his execution, Kemmler was awakened early, dressed in a suit, had his head shaved for better electrical contact, and was led to the electric chair. Despite his calm demeanor and final words, "Take it easy and do it properly, I'm in no hurry," the execution proved to be far more gruesome than anticipated, demonstrating the harsh reality of this new method. Unfortunately, on the first attempt at pressing the switch, William somehow survived, something that caught everyone in the room by surprise. Remember, this was a new execution method and it had never been put to the test before. As such, William was both a lab rat and a condemned man. Upon that tragic failure, the executioners had to come up with a solution quickly to ensure the work was done, so they decided to double down on the voltage. The second surge of electricity was a horror event, haunting those present for years as 2,000 volts surged through William Kemmler's body, filling the chamber with the sound of sizzling flesh. The air also grew thick with the acrid smell of burning, searing itself into the memories of all who were there. Kemmler's body, already tortured by the first shock, now showed horrifying signs of the second execution attempt. Blood oozed from under the straps, and his flesh singed where the electrodes contacted, turning a charred, unnatural color. The scene was brutally violent, far from the sanitized procedure promised to the public and the legal system. Witnesses, including officials and journalists, jumped back at the sight and smell. The New York Times described the stench as unbearable, indicating a death that was not swift and dignified, but prolonged and agonizing. The room, once solemn, had become a chamber of horrors filled with the stink of death. What began as a misguided attempt at scientific progress had become a grotesque display of human suffering. The promise of a quick, painless execution was shattered, igniting controversy and debate about the electric chair for years to come. What if the execution team had opted for hanging? Maybe William's execution could have been quick and less horrifying as opposed to using electrocution. While it may sound perfectly fine to ask such questions, I just don't know what kind of questions you'll ask after going through this next execution. It is something that closely borders the movie Wrong Turn, or even past her death was so wild and brutal. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was implicated in the Babington plot in 1586, named after Anthony Babington, who masterminded the conspiracy. The plan involved assassinating Elizabeth Van and instigating an uprising to put Mary on the English throne. The plot was uncovered by Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, through intercepted letters that included coded messages between Mary and the conspirators. Despite Mary's continuous claims of innocence, these letters were deemed sufficient evidence of her complicity. The trial that ensued was more a formality than a quest for truth, as Elizabeth's advisers were determined to eliminate the threat Mary posed. The trial took place at Fotheringhay Castle in October 1586. Mary, dressed in black, denied all accusations and questioned the legality of the court as she was not an English subject. Despite her arguments, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. She was found guilty of treason on October 25, 1586, and sentenced to death. Elizabeth hesitated to sign the death warrant, knowing the execution of a fellow queen could set a dangerous precedent. However, the pressure from her council and the perceived threat to her life eventually led her to sign the warrant. On February 1, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed on February 8, 1587, in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle. The execution was a grotesque spectacle marked by a series of horrifying events that have echoed through history. On the morning of her execution, Mary, dressed with great care in a gown of black satin over a crimson petticoat, symbolic of Catholic martyrdom, walked to the scaffold with dignity, holding a crucifix and a prayer book. Her calm demeanor was noted by many, even as she faced her death with resolute faith. Upon the scaffold, Mary forgave her executioner and declared her innocence of the charges. She was blindfolded and knelt down on the cushion provided. The executioner, visibly nervous, swung his axe. The first blow struck the back of her head, not her neck, causing immense pain, but not death. A second blow followed, also failing to sever her head completely. Finally, with a third blow, the executioner managed to decapitate her. The botched execution left many witnesses horrified and appalled, adding to the horror of the scene as the executioner lifted Mary's head to show the assembled crowd. Her auburn wig came off, revealing her short grey hair, a complete contrast to her youthful, regal image. Furthermore, her lips were seen to move for about 15 minutes after her decapitation, a common post-mortem phenomenon, but nonetheless shocking to the onlookers. Mary's little dog, a Skye Terrier, was found hiding under her skirts, refusing to leave her mistress even in death, adding a heart-wrenching detail to the already sombre event. The dog had to be forcibly removed, covered in Mary's blood. Next up, the botched clinical execution of Clayton Lockett. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that fateful April evening, the walls of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary braced for an event that would reverberate through the halls of justice and morality. Clayton Lockett, a man whose crimes had sealed his fate, lay on the bed, the clock ticking towards the moment of his scheduled execution. The procedure, meant to be clinical and swift, was about to devolve into a spectacle of suffering and systemic failure. The initial steps seemed routine. The execution team prepared to administer the lethal injection, a method praised for its efficiency and humanity. But as they attempted to insert the IV line, the first signs of trouble emerged. The doctor, aiming for the femoral vein in Lockett's groin area, was met with an unexpected spray of blood, indicating a struck artery. The scene, as later described by the prison warden, became a bloody mess, a complete departure from the sterile finality expected of state-sanctioned death. Despite the complications, the execution proceeded. At 6:23 p.m., the first drug, midazolam, entered Lockett's bloodstream. It was supposed to sedate him to render him unconscious before the other drugs could carry out their lethal task. 10 minutes passed, and the doctor declared Lockett unconscious. But the stillness was short-lived. As the subsequent drugs, vecuronium bromide and potassium chloride, were administered, Lockett's body began to betray the illusion of calmness. He jerked his head, his body writhing against the restraints, moans escaping his lips, a haunting soundtrack to the unfolding chaos. Witnesses, their faces a mix of shock and horror, watched as the man who should have been unconscious seemed to be locked in a battle with death itself. The blinds were drawn in an attempt to shield the onlookers from the horrific scene, but the sounds could not be hidden. The growling noises of distress and the panicked voices of officials, Warden Anita Trammell's voice tinged with fear, expressed concern upon learning that Lockett was waking up and that the execution was not proceeding as intended. In the governor's office, an aide listened in, the moaning noise filtering through the phone line, a clear reminder of the gravity of the situation. In the execution chamber, Lockett had been pricked at least 16 times, the failed attempts at IV insertion leaving him in pain. The execution team's desperation was evident. The doctor, faced with the choice of attempting another line, decided against it. The correct needle was not available, and the one used was inadequate for the task. The state's investigation would later cite the failure of the IV as a critical factor in the botched execution. As you'd expect, the execution was not going as planned. No life-saving measures were given to Lockett. The paramedic's testimony was chilling in its finality. The corrections director, Robert Patton, made the call to halt the execution, but it was too late for Lockett. The aftermath was a fusion of legal and ethical questions. Lawyers filed court documents to stop further executions, arguing that such procedures could be unconstitutionally cruel. Though sealed, the transcripts of interviews conducted by the State Department of Public Safety painted a picture of confusion and distress. A botched clinical execution is unimaginable. It's like doctors performing surgery without anesthesia, forcing the patient to endure the entire procedure. Now imagine an execution by horses. That would be truly horrific. Robert Francis Damiens. Robert Francois Damiens was born on January 9, 1715, in Laulai, near Arras. He was the 8th of 10 children in a family with a hard-working farmer and prison guard father. After his mother's death, Damiens was raised by an uncle in Batuna. His life, marked by discontent and personal struggles, eventually descended into darkness. Damiens, nicknamed Robert the Devil by his siblings, was a wild spirit. His early years were marked by a stint as a soldier, an experience that left him deeply scarred after the siege of Philipsburg in 1734. Seeking solace, he returned to France and found employment as a valet at a Jesuit college in Paris. This position allowed him to mingle with the councillors of the Parliament of Paris, including the vehemently anti-monarchist de la Bouère. Despite his turbulent public life, Damien cherished his private life with his wife, a cook, and his daughter, an apprentice seamstress. He was known for his drunken religious outbursts, which revealed a man torn between piety and rebellion. The year 1757 marked a turning point in Damien's life. On January 5th, the royal family was at the Grand Trianon, while Louis XV stayed behind at Versailles, attending to his sick daughter. Damiens, armed with a rented sword and hat, slipped into the crowd at the Château de Versailles. As Louis XV approached his carriage to join his family, Damiens seized his moment, stabbing the king with a penknife before attempting to flee. The king, initially mistaking the assault for a mere punch, was struck between the ribs, his thick winter clothing sparing him a fatal wound. Captured immediately, Damiens was brought to the Place du Grève in Paris, a site commonly used for public executions. He was tortured prior to his execution to extract information about any accomplices. This included having his hand, which held the knife used in the assassination attempt, burned with sulfur. Yet Damiens maintained his solitary guilt. Louis XV, perhaps swayed by the minor nature of his injury, suggested a symbolic punishment. Damiens was to be publicly executed in the most cruel fashion. The execution was a spectacle of unprecedented cruelty. A vast crowd gathered to witness the event, which quickly descended into a horror display of awkwardness. The main part of Damiens' execution was a process of drawing and quartering. His limbs were tied to horses, which were then driven in different directions to pull his body apart. This process did not proceed as quickly as intended, resulting in prolonged suffering for Damiens during the procedure. Executioners used pincers to tear away chunks of his flesh. Boiling oil, molten lead, and burning pitch were then poured into the wounds, further intensifying his agony. After repeated attempts, the horses eventually succeeded in tearing Damiens' body apart. His limbs were severed, and he finally succumbed to his injuries. This method of execution was intended to be both a punishment and a deterrent, demonstrating the severe consequences of regicide. While Damiens' execution might have been brutal, Wilkerson's death might have been more barbaric. Wallace Wilkerson. In American criminal justice history, few cases are as infamous and unsettling as that of Wallace Wilkerson. Convicted of murder in 1879, Wilkerson's crime and subsequent execution have become a touching symbol of the period's harsh and often brutal penal practices. Wallace Wilkerson was a laborer residing in Utah Territory, where life in the late 19th century was rugged and loaded with personal disputes, often settled outside the bounds of the law. On June 11, 1877, Wilkerson got into an altercation with William Baxter over a game of cribbage in a saloon in the town of Leahy. The argument escalated quickly, resulting in Wilkerson drawing a pistol and fatally shooting Baxter. Wilkerson was promptly arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During his trial, Wilkerson claimed that the shooting was an act of self-defense. However, witnesses testified to the contrary, describing how Wilkerson had provoked the argument and then, in a fit of rage, shot Baxter without immediate threat to his own life. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death by firing squad, a common method of execution in Utah Territory at the time. Wilkerson's execution, scheduled for May 16, 1879, would become notorious for its horrifying and botched nature. At the time, death by firing squad was considered a relatively swift and humane method compared to hanging, which could result in prolonged suffering if not performed correctly. Wilkerson's fate, however, proved otherwise. On the day of his execution, Wilkerson was led to the execution site, a specially designated area within the prison yard. He was offered a chair to sit in, his arms were free, and he was allowed to wear a black hood. Wilkerson, confident and composed, refused to be blindfolded and expressed his desire to face his executioners. 5 riflemen, chosen by lot from a group of volunteers, stood poised to carry out the sentence. 4 rifles were loaded with live ammunition, while 1 was loaded with a blank round. This was a customary practice intended to absolve each marksman of individual guilt by leaving them uncertain as to who had fired the fatal shots. Wilkerson's confidence was evident as he sat in the chair, uttering his final words, "Center on my heart, boys. Don't mangle my body." The command was given, and the executioners fired. What should have been a swift death turned into a gruesome ordeal. The bullets failed to hit their mark accurately. Wilkerson was struck in the arm and torso, but not in the heart. He fell from the chair and began writhing in agony on the ground. Witnesses described the scene as chaotic and nightmarish. Wilkerson was left writhing and moaning for nearly 30 minutes before he finally succumbed to his injuries. The mismanagement of the execution shocked onlookers and the broader public, raising serious questions about the humanity and efficacy of firing squad executions. The botched execution of Wallace Wilkerson was a result of human error in capital punishment. John Lewis Evans. John Lewis Evans III's path to the electric chair began in the winter of 1976, a period marked by a crime spree that would ultimately seal his fate. Alongside accomplice Wayne Evans, he embarked on a 2-month-long rampage across 7 states, leaving a trail of armed robberies, kidnappings, and extortion in their wake. Their criminal odyssey culminated in the cold-blooded murder of pawnshop owner Edward Nassar, a crime that would not go unpunished. As the law closed in, Evans's capture was inevitable. His subsequent confession to the murder, along with a litany of other felonies, painted a portrait of a man beyond redemption in the eyes of the law. Despite his willingness to plead guilty, the prosecutors sought a jury trial, aiming for the death penalty, which could only be imposed through such a process. The trial commenced on April 26, 1977, in a state circuit court. Evans, showing no remorse, admitted to the charge of first-degree murder. His brazen defiance continued as he claimed he would kill again under similar circumstances and even threatened to murder each member of the jury if they did not sentence him to death. It took the jury just 15 minutes of deliberation to return a guilty verdict, and the death penalty was later upheld by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals and the Alabama Supreme Court. The execution began at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. Evans was strapped into the electric chair, known ominously as Yellow Mama due to its color. At 8:30 p.m., the first jolt of 1900 volts of electricity surged through Evans's body. It was supposed to be a swift and decisive end, but it was anything but that. For 30 seconds, the chamber was filled with the sound of electricity and the sight of sparks and flames erupting from the electrode attached to Evans's leg. The execution team and witnesses watched in horror as his body convulsed against the restraints, his fists clenched, forming a horrific image of suffering. The first jolt failed to kill him. The electrode had burst from its strap, and a cloud of greyish smoke and sparks obscured his face. The smell of burning flesh and clothing filled the room, and when two doctors examined Evans, they found to their dismay that he was still alive. The electrode was hastily refastened and a second jolt was administered, only to result in more smoke and the unbearable stench of charred human tissue. Again, the doctors checked Evans's vital signs, only to report that his heart continued to beat. In a desperate plea, the prison commissioner was asked to request clemency from Governor George Wallace, arguing that the botched execution constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The plea fell on deaf ears. Clemency was denied. At 8:40 p.m., a third and final surge of electricity was sent through Evans's body. 4 minutes later, the doctors pronounced him dead. The execution of John Lewis Evans III had taken an excruciating 14 minutes, a period that would be etched in history as one of the most gruesome and botched executions ever witnessed. While it's difficult to fathom the pain Evans experienced, it's equally challenging to comprehend why anyone would be subjected to the methods of execution that Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin faced. On December 11, 1962, Canada witnessed its last executions before the abolition of the death penalty. Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin were the final individuals to face the noose at the Toronto Don Jail, marking the end of an era in Canadian justice. The crimes for which they were convicted were heinous, and the methods of their executions highlighted the cruel nature of capital punishment. Arthur Lucas, a native of the United States, was convicted for the brutal murder of Thurland Crater, a police informant, and his common-law wife, Carolyn Crater. The murders took place in Toronto in November 1961. Lucas, involved in organised crime, was believed to have been hired to kill Thurland Crater to prevent him from testifying in a major narcotics trial. On the night of the crime, Lucas reportedly shot Crater in the head and slit the throat of Carolyn Crater, ensuring their deaths were swift and leaving a gruesome scene behind. The evidence against Lucas was substantial, including witness testimonies and forensic evidence that placed him at the crime scene. Despite his claims of innocence, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, which carried the mandatory death sentence at the time. Ronald Turpin's crime was starkly different but equally severe in the eyes of the law. Turpin, a small-time thief, was convicted of murdering Metropolitan Toronto police officer Frederick Nash. The incident occurred during a routine traffic stop after Turpin had committed a robbery. Attempting to evade arrest, Turpin engaged in a shootout with Officer Nash, which resulted in Nash's death. Turpin's trial was swift given the clarity of the evidence against him, including eyewitness accounts and ballistic reports. He was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. The execution of Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin took place in the early hours of December 11, 1962. The method of execution was hanging, a practice that had been in use in Canada since its early days, but was increasingly seen as barbaric by the early 1960s. Both men were executed simultaneously, a rare occurrence even for that time. The dual execution was intended to be a swift process. However, it became a horrifying spectacle due to several factors. Hanging, as a method of execution, aims to cause a quick death by breaking the neck. However, it can be gruesome if not conducted with precision. In the case of Lucas and Turpin, the process appeared to have gone horribly wrong. Reports suggested that the hangman, a temporary replacement who lacked experience, miscalculated the drop required for both men. For Lucas, the drop was too short, leading to strangulation rather than a quick death from a broken neck. Witnesses described his prolonged suffering as he struggled and gasped for breath. Turpin's drop was also miscalculated, leading to a similar fate. The botched executions highlighted the tragic nature of the practice and stirred public outcry. It's apparent that none of these execution styles are painless and quick. For instance, a lethal injection should be a quick way to execute someone, right? Well, not in this next case, Joseph Wood. John Wood was convicted in 2014 for the brutal murder of his ex-girlfriend, Jenna Harris. The crime was marked by its sheer brutality and premeditated nature. Harris, a 28-year-old aspiring artist, had ended her relationship with Wood, a decision that led to a series of violent confrontations. The relationship had been challenging, with documented instances of domestic abuse and restraining orders. However, Wood's obsession turned deadly when, on a fateful night, he broke into Harris's apartment and stabbed her multiple times. The crime scene was described as horrific, with clear indications of a struggle and overkill, suggesting intense rage and vengeance. During the trial, Wood showed little remorse, and his defense did little to mitigate the overwhelming evidence against him. Eyewitness testimonies, forensic evidence, and his own admission led to a swift conviction. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge handed down the death penalty, a decision that was met with both relief and trepidation by those following the case. Wood's execution was scheduled for early 2014 and would be carried out by lethal injection, a method widely regarded as humane compared to historical practices such as hanging or the electric chair. However, what transpired during his execution left a lasting impression on the public consciousness, casting a shadow over the perceived humanity of lethal injection. On the day of his execution, Wood was led to the chamber and strapped onto a bed. The process began routinely with the administration of a combination of drugs intended to induce unconsciousness, paralysis, and ultimately death. Initially, the execution seemed to proceed as anticipated. Wood's eyes closed, and he appeared to fall into a deep slumber. But the still room was soon disrupted. 11 minutes in, a disturbing change was observed, a quiver of Wood's lip followed by a gasp for air, then another and another. The gasps grew into sounds of labored breaths, each one a jarring reminder that something was terribly wrong. The execution, which should have been a swift and relatively painless procedure, turned into a prolonged and torturous ordeal. Medical experts later suggested that a possible cause was the use of an untested or improperly administered drug cocktail. The drugs used in lethal injections have been a point of controversy, with many pharmaceutical companies refusing to supply them for executions, leading to the use of less reliable substitutes. This incident underlined the potential for error and the horrific consequences of such mistakes. The botched execution of John Wood reignited debates over the death penalty and the methods used to carry it out. Critics argued that what happened to Wood was equivalent to cruel and unusual punishment, a clear violation of the Eighth Amendment of the US Constitution. The visual and instinctive horror of Wood's final moments prompted renewed calls for the abolition of the death penalty and spurred discussions about alternative methods of punishment that do not risk such grotesque outcomes. Supporters of the death penalty contended that Wood's crime was heinous and that his suffering, while unfortunate, did not outweigh the need for justice and retribution. However, the harrowing details of his execution raised serious questions about the moral and ethical responsibilities of the state in administering capital punishment. Hope you guys enjoy this edition. Give us a like if you liked the video and remember to subscribe to Daily Astonishing.